All right, so welcome to this new, fresh class. We decided to do a class that will be about 7 weeks long and fill the gap between Epiphany and Lent. And at the time of Lent, what we'll do is a church-wide study of something. I'm not sure yet, but Benno knows. And cherishes that information in his heart, like Mary. But we will learn about that eventually. So the Lent study will be for all, the whole church will all kind of come together for that. But between now and then, we came up with this class that will sort of consider a question or an issue about the Gospel of Luke in more detail, because the Gospel of Luke is our lectionary gospel for this particular season. We're reading Luke right now in the readings. So that's why we went with Luke. But our question, which is sort of expressed in the title, what we picked for the title of this class, which is the God of the Gospel of Luke. The question is going to be, who is God according to the Gospel of Luke? What is the character of God according to the Gospel of Luke? How is God, as we'll see, as the main character of the Gospel of Luke, how is God at work in the world? All right. We'll save you a seat. So the question is centrally about this: what is a character for the Gospel of Luke that we take for granted quite a bit, but the character God, as opposed to Jesus, who is commonly understood kind of obviously to be the only concern of the Gospels in particular. But this class is going to try to highlight and bring our attention to the way that God is the central character of the Gospel of Luke. And I would argue is the central character of the other three Gospels as well. But at least for Luke, there are specific ways in which God is constructed as the main character of Luke's grander narrative. So the class will try to highlight with each text that we dabble into, and usually it'll be a text or two at a time. We'll try to ask questions, how is God constructed here? Who is God according to this text? What does this tell us about what God is up to, that kind of thing. So that'll be our general focus. Shirley and Sharon will be the other two leaders in this class, and we're finalizing the schedule of who will teach when, but it'll be, each session will be a different person. But I'll be here 3 or 4 times. Shirley will be here 3 times or so, and I think Sharon will be here once or twice. But that's kind of how this will feel. But I'm doing at least the first and the last, and then 2 in the middle somewhere. But next week will be Shirley, to be clear. But the way that we'll kind of organize each meeting will be a little bit looser than, say, the Psalms class was in the fall, where I came with the same format each week. This class will be guided across the 3 leaders by a central set of questions about the Gospel that we just discussed. Namely, like, who is God according to the Gospel of Luke? But we each have different styles and different concerns and different awarenesses, and so we'll bring kind of different lenses to the Gospel of Luke to present, and possibly, I'm not sure how Shirley and Sharon want to do it, possibly different teaching styles or whatever. But we'll kind of be unified by that shared concern. We'll always sort of organize our classes around asking that question about whatever we've brought. But today it falls to me to do sort of the introduction to the class as a whole. So what we'll do today is I've just introduced the class and like what it is. But then I'm going to introduce sort of the Gospel of Luke as a whole, as a text, in terms primarily of how to read the Gospel, or issues in reading the Gospel of Luke, what kind of concerns we need to be aware of when picking up parts of the Gospel of Luke. So that's just a broader introduction to Luke to set the course off and running. But then finally we'll look at some texts from the first 3 chapters of Luke to get us off and running on the actual task of the class, considering who God is for the Gospel of Luke. So, without further ado, I'm going to start talking about some issues around reading the Gospel of Luke and what sort of readers need to bring to, or what awarenesses readers need to have when picking up text from the Gospel of Luke. So I've asked you to turn to Luke 1:1. And this, does everybody have a Bible, by the way? Everybody?
Some back here if you need one.
Okay.
Multiple versions.
And I'll be reading from NRSV. Of course, that doesn't mean you have to, but just FYI, that's what I've got up here. So we're going to start by looking at Luke 1:1-4, which is widely recognized as the prologue to Luke's Gospel. And a concern I want us to be aware of in this class and subsequent ones when reading Luke is that we're actually reading the beginning of a larger work called Luke Acts. Luke is part 1, roughly equivalent to the size of part 2, which is the book of Acts. These are almost certainly composed by the same author. And if not the same author, then someone who knew the author and worked with the author. But the point is, they really are one piece of work that we'll talk about in a minute why they've been separated or divided up into their canonical positions. But understanding Luke and or like Luke's prologue involves understanding the telos of the story, or sort of the ultimate sort of trajectory of where the story goes. And that's not in the end of Luke, that's at the end of Acts. So when you think about the narrative arc of what's going on in any part of the book of Luke, it really is very important not just to ask how does this function in the Gospel of Luke, but how does this function in the work as a whole, which goes from Luke 1 all the way to the end of Acts. As we'll see, there are aspects of the Gospel of Luke that literally make no sense or don't add up or don't have a payoff unless you consider the contents of the book of Acts. So this is actually really narratively important. But without further words, let's read Luke 1:1-4, which is the prologue. Does anybody want to go ahead and read it? Okay, great. That'd be great. 1-4.
Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed.
Great, thank you. So this is a rather famous prologue. It's one of the only moments in Scripture, really, where an author gives us any clue as to what follows and how we should read it and think about it. And certainly it's one of the only places where an author, sort of forwardly reflects on and subjectively reflects on what they were trying to do when they wrote this text, which is really fascinating. And scholars have just had a lot of fun with trying to make something of this reflective statement about the intentionality behind the gospel, as opposed to other texts we call gospels in the New Testament, which just kick off with absolutely no reflective introduction. Here we have Luke saying, all right, some other people have tried to do this thing, writing an orderly account of these particular events. I think I could probably do that too. And here's my attempt at doing it really well. So the first thing off the bat is Luke writes with awareness of other texts or sources about these events. Luke is contributing to a library of existing accounts, which means that when we read Luke, we're reading an intentionally constructed and arranged, orderly account. In other words, Luke's way of telling the story is very important to Luke. Luke is not just trying to tell the story again or tell the story the best way. Luke is trying to tell the story in an intentional way to construct a very particular kind of meaning. In other words, we're going to have to, when we read Luke or any of the Gospels, we really need to reorder our sense of what history telling is about and how history telling works. It's not just an attempt to tell a verifiable order of events, but rather this orderly account is about an order of events that produces meaning, that has power. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but the point is that Luke has constructed for us in this prologue that this work is narrative. It's not just history, it's not a chronicle, it's actually a story. So while it participates in history telling, it also participates in this thing, storytelling, which really has a very light interest in how things actually went down. It's both narrative and a retelling of events that are historical, but the border between those are blended for Luke. So we have to be attentive when we read Luke, not just to the section we're reading, but especially where that section falls in the gospel and how it relates to other surrounding events. Arrangement and order are everything for the Gospel of Luke. Here we have Luke telling us, be aware. Like, I've set this out in a particular way so that you'll hear something in particular as I tell the story. Worth also noting is that Luke does not call this work a gospel, quote unquote. That's a later traditional ascription to the book. Christians later grouped this with the other three gospel texts, and so it became known as a gospel, but here it's characterized as simply an orderly account, which might be better translated narrative in our sort of modern parlance. But to clarify this a bit further, maybe a couple of terms just to introduce for our class to get our heads around the genre of the Gospel of Luke. So the past is the first term. There's the past. Then there's history. And then there's historiography. And I want to just clarify the difference between these three things as we approach this kind of text. The past is literally, when I talk about the past, I'm talking about what happened in this world. Plenty of things happened. I mean, on the same day Jesus was doing whatever he was doing, there were grasshoppers munching grass in the same field. Yeah, people don't mention that, right? So that's the past. I mean, there's stuff going on all over the place, and it doesn't make it into Luke, right? Other people were doing things as Jesus walked down the streets that don't get mentioned. That's all part of the past, the whole thing. It's reality as it happened. History is sort of an ordered idea or account about the past for a particular purpose in the present, and that's the key. History is how we construct the past for present purposes, usually for identity making or having a sense of who we are today. But history itself is not actually a written phenomenon. It can be done in many ways, through art or song or many different mediums to communicate history, through ritual, whatever. We can carry memory in ordered ways through plenty of media. Historiography, to be more specific, is what we have in something like the Gospel of Luke. Historiography literally is, historiography is writing about history. So it's written history. And when you write history, you employ certain tactics to bring history into a coherent form in written media for people to read it. And that's one way of experiencing history as a narrative, narratively constructed. You can do history in other less linear ways when you do it in things like ritual or whatever, but the linear presentation of history in writing is called historiography. And this genre existed in Luke's ancient world. When Luke was writing, there were other Roman histories or whatever, Jewish histories as well. And Luke would have been aware of that probably. But the thing I really want to highlight for us as we approach the Gospel of Luke is the term we're going to use, or I'm going to use, is theological historiography. So what I think Luke is participating in is actually a rich Jewish tradition of how to process and think about the past for theological payoff. Basically, what Luke is doing is the same thing we have in what the Old Testament calls, or what we call the Deuteronomistic history in the Old Testament, which spans Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. It's the story of the kings of Israel and Judah. And it's one big, long project in the Old Testament that effectively shows, or is written in the time of the exile, in order to understand how Israel got to where it is. And what the heck was happening for the last 3 or 4 centuries that led to the present situation of exile. The question is, how did we get here? What went wrong? What was God's involvement? And what can we do now? Like, what is the current situation? So that work of history is actually sort of a work of theological investigation. Luke is very aware of this kind of writing and this kind of project. And in the spirit of that, composes this text, which is an undertaking to write an orderly account of the events that have transpired, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. What truth is that? So that you may know the word for right now about the things that you've heard about, the past events, right? You've heard about the events, but what's the truth concerning these events? What's the payoff? What's happening in terms of God and who God is for the people of God? Another way of putting that might be, Luke is trying to tell them what time it is. And there's a difference between describing what's happened to lead to this point and then describing the moment we're in. Luke's way of telling the past is a way of describing the present. It's a sort of an account of how we got here with God, particularly, though. Not just like, here's what happened literally, there you go. And that's how a lot of scholars have constructed Luke's gospel. It's meant to be the most truthy, accurate account. That's not really the account of order or orderliness that is most useful for reading Luke's gospel. Luke's account of orderliness is not about accuracy or linear arrangement that's perfect and according to verifiable events. Rather, Luke's orderliness is about a story that is powerful and has a lot of meaning, and a lot of impact for the present. A good, orderly story for Luke is going to compel. It's going to have payoff. So that's just to get our heads around sort of how the gospel is conceptualized by its writer, what its payoff is, why it's even interested in the past at all, instead of doing what, say, Paul does, which is writing in a more hortatory or like kind of a preaching mode. Luke doesn't do that. Luke is telling the story, but every bit of it counts as part of a larger project that adds up to a meaning for right now and what's happening today. Any questions about that so far?
Do we know anything about Theophilus?
Oh yeah, no, we don't.
I got that out of the way.
Who's he writing to?
It's important, but I mean, it's a good question. No, we don't know anything about Theophilus. There are different theories. In my opinion, none of them are useful to reading the gospel. So that's
What is the specific person he's writing to?
so that's one theory. There are other theories that think it's sort of a literary device. The word literally means something like lover of God.
Right,
So
yeah.
one kind of group will say, like, this is just Luke addressing anyone who
Right,
follows
okay.
God. And then there's the idea that this is sort of an individual. Probably historically, where I would be at is, it was very common in the ancient world. Well, when you write a text, it costs money, right? I mean, when you produce a text or a history or anything at all, you've got to have funding. You've got to have resources and some way to do that with your day hours. And the Bible's no different. The people who wrote the Bible professionally wrote the Bible, one way or another. And they had to have support. This might just be one of the more explicit references to the support that made the Gospel of Luke happen. This could very well be an early important patron of the church who commissioned the writing of this text because they wanted such a work to be written for the church. I think that's the best going theory. And so it gives us an idea, again, that supports why the gospel was written or whatever, and it gives us some sense about that. But apart from that, it doesn't play much of a role for the rest yet. Let's see. Okay, so a few more points on the reading of the Gospel of Luke, and I'll try to move through these sort of briefly. That was the bigger opening concept I wanted us to be aware of. But a second thing I wanted to say is the Gospel of Luke, just to sort of highlight in a different way what we've been saying, the Gospel of Luke is not a biography. This is a way to get our heads around kind of what the Gospel is doing, what it's not doing. I think readers often come to the Gospel of Luke expecting a life of Jesus. They expect that from many of the Gospels, actually all four of them, there's not many, but they expect sort of Jesus is the main character, it's here because Jesus, and that's what it's about. So I'm coming to this, I'm just going to read Jesus, nothing else is going on here. It's a biography of Jesus, essentially. And biography is a genre that existed in the ancient world, so we wouldn't be shocked to find that happening here, but it's not what's happening here. In fact, while it's centrally concerned with Jesus, it's important, I think, to be very aware that it's really not about Jesus. The Gospel of Luke is not centrally about Jesus. And I know that sounds strange, but I'm trying to highlight that if we were to add up and very synthetically say what the Gospel of Luke is about, what the title of the class and our direction in the class is trying to highlight is that it's really about God's ancient purpose and how God fulfills God's ancient purpose for Israel and for all the people of the world. That's what the Gospel of Luke is interested in. Jesus is a historical way in which God made that purpose probable to happen. Jesus is the way in which that purpose becomes likely, and not just a hope, but rather a reality that is unfolding. For Luke, then, Jesus is a great sign of something that has happened in history that needs to be acknowledged. And so, of course, Jesus is a main character of the Gospel of Luke, but I want us to sort of think about the ways that Jesus is actually part of a story about God, and that God's verbs that we'll see in these texts we'll read this morning, the sort of verbs that go with God, that God is redeeming the world, or that God is saving Israel, that God is feeding the hungry. Those verbs drive the project of the Gospel of Luke. And the verbs of Jesus on the ground sort of fall within the narrative structure of that larger scheme. So it's not to displace Jesus, but rather to highlight the more subtle main character of Luke's Gospel and the story of which Jesus is a part. And I think one of the great mistakes of Christian reading of the Gospels is to think that they start with the Gospels. They don't. They're sort of, I joke as an Old Testament scholar, calling them footnotes or appendix. But seriously, the Christian tradition is rooted in the Jewish root of the Hebrew Bible, such that the Gospels can properly be understood as commentary upon what has already been set forth. And Luke's Gospel certainly presumes this, not only through explicit and constant quotation of Hebrew Scriptures, but through even participating in genres that were set forth by the Hebrew Scriptures. The entire theological project of Luke is attentive to something that the Hebrew Bible teaches, God's promises, and the way that the past can be sort of exegeted to understand what God is up to. So that's just to say sort of the place of Jesus in the gospel and how we should understand, how we should read Jesus as a sign about what God is up to in the world, and not an end to previous stories or a new beginning from them, but a continuation, a climax, if you will, a shocking sign that the stories we've been hearing in Israel's scriptures are true and are coming to fruition.
So, it's so delightful to hear you say that. And I'm not sure that we, in the broadest sense, grasp it well ever, mostly because we're so imbued with a Christological focus, and a Christian narcissism. What you just said gives great comfort to me in my heresy of sort of wanting to scooch away from atonement thinking as an end concern, as a teleological. Here's what and or a beginning or a different way, or something that brushes all the rest of it aside, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And so I just wanted to note that. There are radical implications for what you just said in terms of the Christian community and our place in the world, and our backing off of a sense of entitlement. And so,
absolutely.
we should do more of this. I want to mark it.
That's what I was
and kind of hold it for the community, because it sits in a space, I think, that certainly as a priest I've been in the 30 years of labor what you gave birth to. So it's really nice to hear.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, we don't say that enough. I mean, and, there are some places that would get you kicked out of that, if you said that, right? And it's such a relief, I just felt a sense of relief, like, yeah, we need to say that. We need to be saying that more.
Right, yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Boy, what a gift.
It's a place of humility, and
Right.
it really is refreshing.
So I was chatting with one of my colleagues who's Jewish, and I just said to him the other day, I said, well, Christians are really just kind of wannabe Jews.
Right,
yeah.
Good work for Jesus and bacon.
Because Jesus brings it to everyone, not just the people who are ethnically.
Yeah, and yesterday at the funeral, and just another brief thing, but yesterday at the funeral, the deceased's husband was Jewish, and his son was there as well, grown son. And and I always say, you're invited, et cetera. And I said, if we could just put down our parochial stuff for a minute and find the true good beauty, blah blah blah. We might come to my presence. And then they came up and received communion. And, it was a beautiful moment in its way. And they're not practicing Jews, but it was kind of a radical investment on their part in a non-parochially bounded invitation, I hope.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah. No, this is wonderful. Thanks for your.
I want to go home now.
That's been alcohol.
So 2 more points briefly about, and this will continue very much so in the text we bring up in just a minute. This exact conversation, it will be much more powerfully explicit, I think, in Mary's own words here in a minute. But first, I just wanted to note before we get going on that a couple more sort of broad introductory issues to how to read. Just to sort of synthesize actually some of what we were just saying, the narrative unity of Luke Acts, I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but I want to put some words to what that narrative is, the narrative sort of cycle that exists on the side of the scope of the whole. The narrative that we see over the course of Luke Acts is a story, as I said, with God as its main character and God's active verbs as the main action of the story, with Jesus almost being a verb in a sentence that is about God. And that, by the way, is what we share with, we were just talking about it, but that's how to articulate the gospel correctly as Christians, as people who are literally dependent on the gospel about God's people Israel. We talk about what God did for Israel through Jesus, and that's the central claim about what makes it possible for Gentiles then to participate in this story and to be grafted into this tree, to use Paul's metaphor for Romans 11. But what I want to highlight here is just in a sentence that the Gospel of Luke combined with Acts, so the story Luke Acts, is about the working out of God's purpose to bring salvation in all of its fullness to all people. So salvation is the goal, and we'll talk about that term and what it entails. In all of its fullness, I'm trying to highlight because the Gospel of Luke and Luke Acts as a whole, it really challenges our notions of what we think salvation actually is about and involves. Salvation for Luke is a holistic vision of good life for humans. It's not about some specific sliver of our lives that is spiritual in nature or whatever. In fact, it's rarely about that at all for the Gospel of Luke. Rather, salvation in its fullness means good, healthy, safe, hopeful lives for human beings. This is a promise to Israel through Abraham originally, a very earthy, fleshy promise, as we'll see soon, family, children, land. And these promises, because they're coming true for Israel, God wants to bring them to fullness for the rest of the world as well, to share in that. That's the story going on in Luke Acts as a whole. And this is why it's so important to keep Acts in mind, because that doesn't happen in Luke. That begins in Acts, ultimately. In fact, Jesus has very little to do or say about Gentiles in the Gospel of Luke. The mission to the Gentiles only really begins in Acts. So the whole narrative arc of Luke can't make much sense without the emergence of an explosion of the Spirit in the church beginning in the book of Acts. This is the obvious and logical payoff for Luke of a story about Jesus that reaches its sort of bigger climax in the spreading and the making known of the message about God through Jesus. And we'll see that as we keep going. Let's see. I think with that, we will move to getting into the text, because I really want to make sure we leave a good bit of time for that.
Can I just?
Yeah,
I mean, it's
absolutely.
just so. The other thing that pops for me is that in Acts it's about the Spirit. So from a doctrinal space, we move away from the historical figure of Jesus into the animating force of God in Acts. And our creed, interestingly, gives us a grammatical door to open in that regard. We talk about Jesus in past tense, and several years ago I started a sermon and I said, we don't need Jesus. And there was an audible gasp, like, woo! But it's that kind of thing that, here's this historical, here's this present. So anyway, I'm just, there are pieces in the tradition that are part of this, part of the minority voice, I suppose, or this, anyway.
Absolutely. To move to the text and to continue all these conversations, I don't mean to stick a divide on what we're talking about. We can keep all these going, but I want to do it in light of what we see Luke saying in the first couple chapters. Specifically, I want to read the voices of Mary and Zechariah, who both, early on, remember how we talked about Luke's sort of very intentional presentation of material? So Luke gives an orderly account of events for several chunks of chapters, that are suddenly interrupted at several points throughout the first 3 chapters of Luke with these great poetic expositions of what's going on. That's what Mary and Zechariah both do. And there are several others who do it as well. We see Simeon do it in the next chapter. But these kind of bring the orderly account of events to a screeching halt as you're reading, and force the reader to stop and listen to Mary or Zechariah tell us what time it is. Essentially, and that's a phrase that I think is really useful for the Gospel of Luke. And that's because, by the way, Mary and Zechariah are functioning here as prophets, and I think one of the most useful definitions of a prophet is that they're people who tell us what time it is, and that's what Mary and Zechariah are doing here. They're stopping in the order and saying, okay, here's what's going on, and they announce it for the reader. It's so important then to understand that Luke's theological historiography, remember, is not trying to capture what the camera would have caught. Rather, it's constructing for us powerful, meaningful characters who are conveying the truth of what was happening, right? This is not necessarily what Mary literally did or said. And maybe this is obvious, easy stuff for you all to process, but I just want to be clear that as we're reading, this is an artful presentation of people that's meant to heighten our awareness of the truthiness or the realities that are most important to Luke about what was happening. It's not of interest to Luke scientifically, whether the virgin birth happened at this time and the birth happened at that time. It's a presentation of theological art that gives our imaginations the ability to grasp what the heck is going on with this thing that is Jesus. And with that, I want to highlight, before we read their texts, the 2 different ways that Zechariah and Mary respond to the different news that is brought to them, and how those 2 different ways, I think, sort of offer the reader, I think, different options for how to receive the mystery that is being presented in the gospel as a whole. We kind of see these characters that we can identify with, one or the other. The first is Zechariah, who receives the announcement that as a childless couple, they'll have a baby, and this baby will be a powerful prophet. It'll be John, as you all know. But Zechariah's response to this announcement, which is in the temple, Zechariah's response in verse 18 of chapter 1 is, "How will I know that this is so? For I'm an old man and my wife is getting on in years." We're not going to dwell on this for long, but how will I know? That's the nature of Zechariah's question. And for this question, he's described as not believing by the angel in a moment, and he's muted as a result, sort of punished, if you will, or told that for this lack of belief, he'll be mute until the thing itself happens, which is the case. But this question specifically is, how will I know, right? How can I get my head around this? How can I make sense of this? Show me sort of proof or something like that. What is the sign? That's the nature of Zechariah's response to the sort of powerful surprise at work. Mary's response, which is sort of in parallel, Mary gets an announcement several verses later, which, by the way, it comes in the context of the announcement about John, right? These two are intimately linked for the Gospel of Luke. But in verse 34, and we won't read the whole announcement of the angel, who describes the coming king, essentially, to be born from Mary. Mary responds in Luke 1:34, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" And this is subtle, but I want us to appreciate the difference between these questions and how Mary's response is a faithful response. Mary is just as mystified and confounded. But Zechariah's question is, how will I know? Almost a grasping for power over the announcement itself. Like, let me own this. Let me understand the whole thing. Mary's is a grasping at mystery, a wonderment, and an acceptance, really, I think. There's no sort of, I'm not ready to take this news. There's rather just a, how can this be? A shock and awe. And I think what's important to highlight there is that the postures represented by both do involve being confounded, not necessarily understanding, but that Zechariah's is a grasping for knowledge, while Mary's is really not a grasping, but just an exclamation in the face of this news. And I think Luke suggests, through the way that they're both treated, that it's Mary's response we should model, some kind of a posture of wonderment and readiness for the mystery of what God is doing, but certainly confusion and shock is appropriate. And the coming song and prophecy of Mary and Zechariah, I think, are Luke's way of showing us then some of the answer to these things, in a way that holds all the mystery in place, but doesn't let us quite settle yet. That's what the rest of the work will do. With that said, let's hear Mary and Zechariah. And I'll just go ahead and read through them so we can just hear them and kind of keep chatting them. So just listen to Mary's song first. And this is, I'll start with Elizabeth, actually, in verse 45. Elizabeth is speaking to Mary, and she confirms what I was just describing about how Mary's response is heard. In verse 45, Elizabeth says, "And blessed is she, that is Mary, blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord." So Mary is counted with belief by Luke. In verse 46, Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, for he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him, from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever." This is Mary's song, or as it's known, a song. What is happening here, just to highlight it before hearing Zechariah, and then we'll kind of open it up. But Mary has stopped and announced what is going on. And you'll notice that if you were in the Psalms class in the fall, this is a psalm of praise. It follows the form of a psalm of praise. A psalm of praise announces something about God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. I want to praise this God because, and then it lists reasons why that praise is rightful, why it makes sense. And it does so narratively. It describes things God has done that are good reasons why God deserves praise. But as a whole, the Psalm of Praise, I want to argue, has sort of the character of a challenge beneath it. It carries a responsibility for those who hear it to decide whether it makes good sense, whether it's true, whether these claims really are weighty and deserve praise, right? It's our responsibility then to hear this song of praise and to consider these theological claims that Mary is making, all of which have God as their subject. They suggest that we should read the Gospel of Luke with reference to this claim that Mary's making and ask whether we see these things happen in the Gospel of Luke. And Luke, I think, is going to shock us with the ways they don't happen as we expect, and they do happen. He's telling us they do happen, and it's sometimes quite hard to understand how or if they did. But Luke's point in putting this in the prologue is to suggest they do. And remember, Luke knows the end of the story he's writing. And the claim is, what you hear in this song is what unfolds in this text, according to Mary. Let's hear Zechariah, and then we'll sort of reflect as a whole on what we heard in these texts. So after John is born, and there's the naming of the child, this is when Zechariah speaks again, right? And this comes in verse 67. They basically get Zechariah to confirm that his name will be John, and it's at that moment that Zechariah opens his mouth for the first time. So verse 67 has him saying this. Then his father Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit and spoke this prophecy. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has looked favorably on his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a mighty Savior for us in the house of his servant David, as he spoke through the mouth of his holy prophets from of old, that we would be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us. Thus he has shown the mercy promised to our ancestors, and has remembered his holy covenant, the oath that he swore to our ancestor Abraham, to grant us that we, being rescued from the hands of our enemies, might serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. And you, child, that's John, will be called prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways, to give knowledge of salvation to his people, by the forgiveness of their sins. By the tender mercy of our God, the dawn from on high will break upon us, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. So, I want us to spend the rest of the time, having heard these texts, and in light of what's been said earlier, I want us to spend our remaining time answering this question. In these texts, which announce what God is doing at this moment, according to the Gospel of Luke, which announce what time it is in terms of God and God's actions. In these announcements, what is God up to? What do we see God doing? Who is God according to these texts? And who should we expect God to be as we continue reading the Gospel of Luke according to these announcements? I can provide plenty of contributions, but we'll, I'm excited to hear what y'all see in this text as well.
It's a God who's provided, right?
Okay.
Has come through on some things,
Right.
and
There's a story in the works,
yeah,
and God is, we're at the end of it, sort of. Yeah.
yeah.
Filling the hungry, he's giving light to those who sit in darkness.
Right.
Yeah. He's there for the marginalized.
Yeah, so
Modern,
what kinds of things, just at a very basic level, like what kinds of stuff is God up to in these texts? What plane of reality is God at work in, according to these texts?
Sort of feels like a leveling of the playing field.
Huh. Okay. What do you mean by that? Or can you say more?
This inequality of, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, that's terrible. But, this sort of idea of like, God's going to sort of even this out for
Right.
us,
Right.
that's what God's up to in
Yeah.
all of this work. It's
Right.
Sort of,
Yeah, and that, I mean, to follow on that, like, what, I mean, instead of leading it, like, how about more specifically, like, is that a spiritual matter? Is that a physical matter? Is it?
It's very down to earth. It's physical,
right.
what's happening in the world.
Yeah, so
It's not about some future after death.
No.
certainly not. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. So Sharon's lifting up this, like, idea about rich and poor are an issue for these texts, right? About God. God is the subject of sentences with verbs that act against rich and poor, which are just to get it on the table, like very material and physical realities, right? These are not issues of, as you just said, after death. They are issues very much of this life, right? So that's just a first concrete thing to note. The kind of things God is up to or concerned with here are very here and now, very physical, very fleshy. Go ahead.
And in the response, Zechariah and Mary, Zechariah is an epistemological one. How am I going to know this? It's in his head. It's a labeling. It's as you said, a power grab kind of thing. Mary says, well, tell me how it's going to happen.
Right.
And it's going to happen in the flesh. I mean, it's a really, it's an interesting sort of nuance. And Mary's response is a Moses response. Moses sees a burning bush and goes, how's this deliverance going to happen?
Right.
What tools are you going to use? And God says, well, here are the tools I'm going to use, and it's you. And that, that just is kind of a, before Zechariah goes, gets into his head, and it's like, well, it's a doubt-filled, binary kind of approach to God. Well, can you prove it to me or not? And until you do, I'm not going to believe it. And Mary's is very pragmatic.
Right.
Well, and maybe the juxtaposition of just these two people.
Right.
That you've got somebody powerful, a priest like Zechariah, versus Mary, the lowly servant.
Yeah.
There it is, right there in the
characters.
Yeah, and yet on that point, which is so important to highlight Zechariah's priestess and Mary's sort of, she is outside the circles of institutional religion, we'll say. Like, she does not hold that kind of office. Yet, it's important to emphasize that for Luke, the temple continues to be this central locus of transformative activity. Priests and what we might call now religious leaders, which is a problematic category for Luke, religious versus non-religious. It's all the same for Luke. The priests are involved in many ways like this with what God is up to. So, and I think one of the payoffs for that, just to put it out there, is we often, I think, come to the Gospels expecting to see Israel's religious institutions destroyed and flattened to make way for this new spiritual cult that is Christianity or something like that. Here in Luke, in the prologue itself, we have this claim that God is both at work in the lowly and marginalized, and yet also is working deliberately and clearly in the temple, literally, talking to Zechariah in the temple with an angel. Coming to a priest and having a priest who is identified in the opening verses of Luke, right after the prologue. Zechariah and Elizabeth are identified in verse 6. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. A good claim. Luke is excited about Torah-following Jews. That's not a problem. Like, the Torah is not the problem. Jews are not the problem. They become a problem for the church later in Acts in terms of the antagonisms between Jewish and Christian, but not in the way that we often come to the text expecting. There's a wrestling, but the temple, a Jewish priest, Mary, a young Jewish poor woman, they're both people through whom God is working this great plan. They're put in tight conjunction. So we can, I think, draw contrasts, but also highlight the way that both of these loci or places are important places of God's transformative activity and renewing activity. Go ahead.
Just to bring it into 2019, so God shuts up the powerful man and lets the young
right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Her too.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. I agree.
It's
Pardon me.
seems like they're almost speaking different audiences. Like they're kind of switched around where Zacharias kind of talks about, he kind of sets the stage a little more. Talks about like background and fulfillment.
Right.
Whereas that comes in at the like references to Abraham and Mary come in at the very end.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're adding emphasis to speak to different people.
Yeah. Right.
Like one is kind of talking to Zacharias, is kind of saying like, look, this is stuff we're familiar with. This is fulfillment of the covenant.
Right.
Whereas Mary's kind of jumps right into like what's going to happen, and then
Yeah.
back like
Right.
also references Abraham, but at the end,
Right.
almost as if
Absolutely.
the importance is switched. The
Yes.
emphasis, rather.
I think that while Mary's song and Zechariah's prophecy do spend different amounts of time on the issue of the past covenant, Mary is actually the whole time pretty much quoting scripture from different places, evoking the sort of past promises, and this sort of thesis statement at the end that sums it all up about Abraham, I think, comes in for a climax. But yes, the differences are there in that sense. However, there are other like thesis statements throughout Mary's song that in Jewish ears ring with the sound of huge implications for a climactic moment in history. One of the ones worth lifting up is this verse in verse 51. He has shown strength with his arm and scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. Yahweh's strong arm in the Hebrew Bible is reserved for moments of massive upheaval and redemptive action by God, most famously in the Exodus moment. And Mary is very much here, not by coincidence, constructed by Luke as a mirror character to Miriam on the shore of the Red Sea, lifting up her song about God's triumph over the powerful, for the marginalized and the vulnerable. So there are other ways in which Mary evokes her participation in the past character of God and God's past promises and past actions, sort of announcing, in this moment, in me, God is doing one of the great things that God will ever do. Just like to highlight before we're done, to make sure we notice a couple little things that are said about God that set the gospel on its course. Just want to highlight some of the verbs. We just looked at, he's shown strength. God has, in verse 52, brought down the powerful from their thrones. Verse 53, he has filled the hungry, right? Hunger is a problem in the Gospel of Luke, to be dealt with by God through Jesus somehow. And these things are according to the promises to Abraham, right? Which evokes the promise that we don't talk about a lot in the church, but this promise, just to recall, was for family, a great family, a land, literally a place to live, a healthy land to work and enjoy, and finally, to be a blessing to all the families of the world, somehow, through Abraham's family, which literally means making it possible for the other families of the world to have land and children, to live healthy and well. A very fleshy and earthy kind of drama is unfolding here. But in Zechariah, just to add to the list, here we see that God is somehow redeeming his people. So redeeming Israel is something God does in Luke, one way or another. That's a part of the drama. But in verse 71, this other whole dimension of this reality unfolds that I think is so important for us to carry with us into the Gospel of Luke, that we would be saved from our enemies, from the hand of all who hate us. Enemies are a problem for the Gospel of Luke, to be clear. Like, this is not just good news, this is also bad news for certain people. The Gospel is a complex prophetic word that announces a new regime in the world. A new reality is unfolding that will have implications for every living person in the world. And as we saw in the Psalms, if you were there, there's a constant awareness about